promotion, should be about event culture, by saying no, it should be about conceptual search, about aesthetics, about hidden things, about the kind of like artistic autonomy, which kind of like twists our understanding of what kind of be possible. So in this kind of like grand art, the general tendency is this kind of like administration of aesthetics and kind of like NGOization of culture. What means that there are like different type of bodies of NGOs, which kind of like survival and also our personal survival depends on flow of resources. So at the end we do certain projects only because there are money available, and because there is not enough money never. It provides a huge kind of like leverage on what kind of culture is being produced, and also influences directly the content of different type of projects. In Poland it is related like to this kind of ideas like this riverbank thing, but also to the different type of cultural diplomacy, like you know, we have like year after year. The first year is like year of Chopin, another year is of some other Polish poet or painter, or like some other famous figure, and you just kind of like, oh, it's like EU presidency or different type of things which are kind of like invented in different type of offices by bureaucrats of culture, and then they're kind of like downstreamed on cultural producers who, because of lack of choice, do it as they need resources to fund themselves and fund their ideas. So the techniques that we kind of like that we tried in this particular project is definitely kind of like appropriation of grant resources. Okay, we say, okay, there are these ideas of these guys, but these are not our ideas. So what to do with this? You can try to twist and tweak it. You can try to smuggle different things inside. This is this idea of the kind of like porous systems in which you just say one thing in the application and you do anyway what you want to do at the end. It's quite obvious, so it's about this a bit of a tactical maneuvering without the systems of funding, and obviously it's very frequently about some sort of like humorous dissent or kind of like embedded criticism, but also about establishing different type of initiatives which try to survive despite despite sort of like availability of funding. Like we do this other project which is called Freeslow University of Warsaw, in which for example like last summer camp, in which we try to balance, let's say, different type of paid activities with unpaid involvement, with volunteer involvement, and with trying to bring in people. Sometimes we try also to do things in such a way that we have an official grant which we use for to pay and to gather resources, and kind of like by internal taxation, let's say, or internal redistribution, to get resources to the projects or ideas that would never be funded. Like we made this with the summer camp in last year, when we simply took a bit of money from the official grant as a kind of honorary for what kind of fixtures job, and then used it to buy food for people who were gathering in a kind of like remote countryside for our summer camp, so that we could cost them a bit better than we would be able as a way around. So talking about Freeslow University of Warsaw, it is quite important. I'm going now to another aspect, which is securing autonomous time, which is about basically short-termism. What means that independent curators are dependent and exposed to structural risks and competition, which results in short-termism, multitasking, lack of disposable time, and eradication of a critical distance. Basically it looks like this. As we do not have any kind of stable income, we have to compete for like short-term support for different projects that we would like to convene and to organize. So we kind of turn into some sort of like short-term entrepreneurs who compete between each other for the ever-shrinking pool of resources. And because of also new technologies and management techniques, we need to, or we are capable of multitasking, what usually ends up with doing, like you try to distribute risks by taking 5 or 6 projects in the same time, out of which maybe 1 or 2 are going to work. But still, there is a lot of hassle involved in all these application systems. And majority of people I know, at least in Poland or also in countries like Germany, maybe it's, thanks God, it's a bit different in Norway, but still in a situation where we're not talking about England even. But whenever there are resources in this kind of grant system, majority of people spend time on securing the next project or trying to report on the last one. And this is how, this is like, possibly 50% of your time is spent on this kind of like silly tasks, which is kind of like administrating yourself and turning into a bureaucrat. And when you ask people, like, what they are doing or what would they like to do, usually what comes up is that there is a lack of free disposable time. So that you are like, that everybody has a certain feeling of total overproduction that you are involved in, and especially overproduction of different types of administrative tasks that you have to fulfill to make anything. And it eradicates the free time which people would like to devote usually to some sort of research or any kind of like critical reflection. This was more or less one of the very, how it looks like. Sometimes it looks like, sometimes it looks ridiculous. Like I did this project which was called Zenot, which was a kind of like truck traveling between a kind of like, let's say, moving nomadic camp, which occupied different public spaces. And we had an idea that it would be a kind of like sort of hippie community. So that we invited artists to kind of like produce on the spot, be there, and then create a kind of like presence in the public space. But as we had internet on spot, it ended up with people being in 6 different places in the same time and working on 5 different projects and not necessarily focusing on the here and now in a sense of like, of working or like on being and exchanging with the very close environment. Because you have to have this kind of like, it's a matter of survival more or less. You have to have, as an artist, you have to have this kind of like future perspective and risk assessment, which is very entrepreneurial kind of idea, which allows you to kind of like, to somehow secure as a freelancer, any kind of like disposable income, which is actually a matter of the physical survival and also any kind of like realization. So with Frieslow University of Warsaw, basically at the very start, it actually started like this. It started as a kind of critical reflection upon this kind of like specific mode of operation, this short-termism in which we are all entangled, let's say, and trying to build a kind of like a mock research institute which would have some sort of like long-term or at least a bit longer-term time perspective than just like one short project, which is simply being made, finished, reported and done, and you go for the next big thing, changing usually your topic, so you can, as a curator, I know a lot of people who are turning from like interest in labor to interest in eco-politics, from eco-politics they go into like formalism and whatever. I mean, it's like, you have a range of things and you usually try to get this like next big hit. But still, in this kind of situation, we wanted to have something which is exceeding this kind of like short-term logic of the project, short-term logic of the grant, and go over time and somehow is a kind of like, let's say, a longer point of reference, and try to also secure a bit of resources for people like us, for cultural producers, to get a bit of a moment of time to start kind of like critically reflect upon what the fuck are we at all doing here? What are we doing? What are our tasks? How are we actually channeled, let's say, and in this kind of like situation of running from one project to another. Obviously, like, we also suffered from the kind of like overproduction in this Frieslow University. We try to utilize this kind of like power of delay to reflect and stop, but I have to admit it's a real struggle. I mean, like both technologically, technology-wise, and in terms of our lives and velocity of communication, it is not such an easy thing to stop doing things. I mean, try it once, and and this is, I tell you, it's not easy. Even if you have money, there is this kind of idea that maybe in 1 year you will not have money, so there is this kind of like urge for constant overproduction, because you can somehow be busy, and it's a kind of internalized drive which quite frequently results in a kind of anxiety if you do not have to do anything, or if you are not busy, and being busy is treated as a badge of honor. I mean, this is quite funny also in a globalized art scene. But usually people are quite proud of being busy, or at least they try to look even more busy than they actually are, so that they are treated as wanted and as successful. Because being busy is a very Protestant idea that being busy means that you are successful. So we try to do this. Maybe I'll show you kind of like funny thing that I did. I think it was 2008. It was called Never Work, or the Price of Laziness, and it was a picnic that I organized. And I organized it as oh, this is a nice picture. I want to show it. This is Mladen Stilinovic, this is my friend Olivier, and this is a picture of Zygmunt Rydka, from 70s, where they were actually much less busy than we are now, which is also quite fascinating. If you think about the completely different type of understanding time, in different also kind of like very prolonged art pieces, which happen, or durational art pieces, which were so popular in 70s, and about what happens now in terms of this very fast circulation of the quiet, like of the things. So I did this picnic as part of actually Danish program, which was called Work Affair. So it was affair about work, and it was about the precarity, and it was a satellite event. And I think that these people from Denmark, they were quite industrious and productive. I'm not sure whether they were so happy with what we did. And of course it was a quite strange thing, because I also worked myself totally. I mean, I overworked myself to prepare it, so that other people can consume and be lazy a bit. But still, it was, I think, very funny thing. So it's more about this whole strand of slacking, withdrawal of labor, of refusal of activity, of this kind of like things like I would prefer not to, all this situation of kind of like refusing a certain type of activities and trying to rather slow down and create setups in which you can actually you do not have to work yourself, work your ass off, or you just you provide an autonomous situations for the kind of autonomous time to appear, which, as one guy, very interesting guy from New York, says that this kind of like art is this kind of activity which is neither productive nor unproductive. So of course it was like people were discussing, people were networking, people were doing different things, we were having fun, and so on and so on. So it wasn't only slacking in terms of not doing anything, but it was also not productive in the sense of this kind of like industrial production, which I think is a quite interesting way of coping with the thing. So another thing is like this logic of network, which is basically quite interesting situation in which we as cultural producers or independent cultural producers are dependent on securing our access to different type of networks in which the money are being distributed on the global scale. And usually what it means, it means that you try to be linked with the people who are well linked. It's a typical example. It's a kind of like opening, trying to get to the proper opening, and the proper opening, trying to talk with proper people, so that you are seen by other people while talking with proper people, and at the end, your kind of like social position rises. So it's like with web pages. You have to have you have to be linked with well linked pages to be well linked on yourself. So in this sense, kind of like this sense, there is this kind of like very conforming power of this kind of networks, which is even more conforming and even more dangerous. But majority of resources are being monopolized in this kind of like in this kind of like global networks. At least in countries like Poland, maybe it's a bit different in Norway, but because you have like quite like well-established public funding on a local scale. But in Poland, being visible outside is a precondition for any kind of like any kind of cultural production, not only freelancing, but any sort of like the main money flowing in are provided by securing access to the international networks of exchange because Poland is simply a poor country, and not only this, it's also like not very well investing into their own cultural scene. So there is this kind of like interesting situation of like competitive networking, in which you network with other people and keep a certain type of distinctive sociability, in a sense of socializing. It's kind of about constant socializing, but with a certain type of distinctive or competitive market. So it's like maybe it can be compared to court of monarchs, in which you had all these aristocrats at one court trying to somehow figure the ways how to champ a beat in this kind of like symbolic hierarchies, which were sometimes very elaborated, who speaks with whom, why not, and what kind of access to the king does the one have. So I would say, I think that in arts it is a quite like a similar thing, and obviously there is this very huge advantage of the central nodes in the station, in the network, which have or gatekeepers, which kind of like monopolize power and also monopolize resources. And what of course leaves the whole question about what happens with this kind of like, let's say, counter networks, or this kind of artistic dark matter of all these independent bottom-up initiatives, which are usually deprived of the majority of resources. Obviously, what happens is it's a quite similar like to alto-globalistic movement, in a sense that like alto-globalists as the ones who are definitely on a disprivileged position if you compare them to WTO and so on, try to use the tools of the enemies, in a sense of like using internet and means of communication to create or establish different type of counter networks or chains of equivalences between, as Chantal Mouffe calls it, between different politicized practices, critical initiatives on both local and international case, and this is usually the case. Like this is one of the ways how I ended up here with as we knew each other with Jesper, and we knew each other with other people, or that's how we kind of try to establish with this Frislow University of Warsaw. We try to establish different types of connections and links with politicized other kind of like critical practices, like critical practice in London, and different type of like, you know, for example, like there is this manifesto of Haben and Brauchen, an initiative from Berlin, with whom we have a kind of like structural equivalence. We share quite similar positions, so we try to cooperate with each other. Like I translate their things, they translate my things, and try to support, let's say, the cause. Okay. And okay, so do you want me to go to this division of labor and expanded notion of authorship, or do you have any questions related to the things that I've already said? Should I still follow?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So, the kind of like the vast thing is this division of labor and expanded notions of authorship. The practical controversy is, let's say, that independent cultural projects comply with the modes of dividing labor, attributing authorship and appropriating intellectual property, which are fundamental for the functioning of a contemporary art market and contemporary capitalism in general. What does it mean, basically? It means that in the process of commissioning art, which I like do quite frequently as a person who is somehow involved in the public art. Like, let's say I can show you this knot thing. So this was this track that we did, and so we produced quite a lot of different art pieces here with different artists. And what happens quite interestingly is that in the process of production there is a lot of different contingent and negotiated situations in which people share their ideas, in which people kind of cooperate, in which people exchange, in some people are producers. Here the producer was also, she also used to work as an artist, but as she had to make a job, she became an assistant of different artists. Or even like maybe even more, I can tell you on this example. So with this particular situation, the kind of like consecrated artist who we invited to propose something had only a concept as a kind of like general sketch in which was supposed to be somehow created, while the whole physical production was made by somebody else, and also the development of technology. But also it was a kind of like, it was related to the different type of projects and ideas which were floating around, just as this very project disappearing as a riverbank. There was, I think, 3 or 4 projects in the same time in Poland about disappearing, some kind of like wave of invisibility, let's say. So out of this very contingent situation, which is mixing with a lot of different agents, let's say, are involved, you end up with the art piece, which is having like a very defined particular author, who is kind of like who is monopolizing the whole set of this let's say intuitions and so on, like as his own idea. What basically leaves the whole kind of like distributed networks of distributed creativity of this kind of like dark matter in which the ideas float, in which different inspirations are exchanged, completely out of equation. The distribution of resources does not depend on this kind of labor. Sometimes it is paid, but sometimes it is more located in a kind of like even more general situations. Like, for example, I'm sure that like in the art school or in different places you have these situations in which you simply exchange ideas with people, or you are going for a beer talk with your friends, you are floating different type of ideas, and at the end you find these ideas being realized in somebody's art piece, or maybe you do realize it as your own art piece, which is a quite natural process. And I think that this is not something super wrong in it, because usually there is always somebody needed who sits, do it, and kind of like has a will and then believe in this kind of idea to produce it. The problem is that in our current system, all the other exchanges and all the other situations are completely excluded from the picture. So all the remuneration is based only on a kind of like, majority is based on a very tangible authorship, which is attributed to a very singular person or maybe group of individuals, but it's never really distributed. Yeah, it always has to be very clearly defined. At least if you take a look at, very simple thing. If you go to the gallery and you take a look at the informations which are provided, it's name of the author, title of the piece, and name of the owner, whose courtesy it is to get this piece from what kind of collection or whose ownership it is. So these are the 3 things, but you never get an idea, for example, about who was the partner of the artist at this time, which possibly, this is this old question, who cleaned socks for Picasso, or like who was the kind of his inspiration. Maybe because usually these were women who actually ended up completely vanished from any kind of like art history. This was a very female issue, or used to be. in which like women played the role of supporters,